Chapter 7 is focusing on um, labor markets. So labor markets is really an extension of Chapter 2 and 3 when we talked about the supply and demand model. Where here we're just talking about labor market as our market, where we're talking about the demand for labor as the demand curve, the supply of labor as the supply curve. Firms are now going to demand labor in the labor market, whereas workers, citizens, are going to supply their labor in the labor market. The downward sloping demand for labor curve is just like the downward sloping demand curve we looked at in Chapter 2, and now the supply of labor curve is going to be upward sloping, just like the supply curve in Chapter 2. And now we have the labor market, and you get an equilibrium point of now wage, which is the price of labor, and quantity of labor in the market. So a very similar discussion as Chapter 2 was talking about the goods market, except now we're talking about the very general labor market conditions. A couple of the important topics in Chapter 2, we talk about derived demand. Derived demand focuses upon demand that is determined or driven by demand for other products. It walks us through the factors that change the demand for labor and factors that change the supply of labor. Now, this is going to move the demand of labor and the supply of labor curves to the left and to the right. Therefore, you'll get increase in wage, increase in quantity, labor, decrease in quantity of labor. And it works us through some of those in Chapter 2. So be sure and read that very carefully. It also works us into some government involvement in the labor market. Specifically, there's a good discussion on the minimum wage. Minimum wage actually is a popular topic in the news today. Lots of really good arguments surrounding the minimum wage, both pro and con. Some of the pro arguments for minimum wage is that businesses, firms would pay people so little that they couldn't live if there was not a minimum wage out there. Good arguments for minimum wage is that there has to be some check on business, and that people have to somehow be supported against the power of a business. Now, some of the cons for minimum wage, one would be, how do we know where to set the minimum wage, and is there a wage that's too much? For example, in the news today, there's lots of fast food workers, particularly McDonald's workers around the country, that are asking for $15 an hour, and therefore a minimum wage of $15 an hour. Clearly, a $15 an hour minimum wage would have a tremendous impact on the economy at large, and perhaps is not the best thing to do, since the wage should represent what you bring to the business, what your skills, education, training, and the debate goes back and forth whether we actually need a minimum wage or not, and if we do need a minimum wage, what should the minimum wage be? Currently at $7.25 is the federal minimum wage. Many states and local governments actually have higher minimum wages. In Kentucky, for example, our minimum wage is equal to the federal minimum wage at $7.25. President Obama and many in Congress are pushing a proposal that would actually raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 an hour, and that's an ongoing debate that we're having. Should it be raised, and if it should be raised, how much? And on the other side, there's even arguments to abolish the minimum wage and just allow employer and employee to negotiate a wage based on their skill level, training, education, and so forth. Lots of things can be said about minimum wage, both pro and con. There's also a good discussion in Chapter 7 on labor unions. What's the impact of labor unions? What do they do? What do they not do? What are they intended to do? Topics like collective bargaining are important, the ability to get workers together to bargain for better conditions and wages and benefits. There's topics of mediation and arbitration, where you get third parties to come in to mediate between employer and employee if agreement can't be made on wage and benefits and so forth. A couple good paragraphs on right to work laws. And in Kentucky, that's also a pretty big topic, as Republicans in the state house and in the state senate are very much in favor of right to work laws being passed in Kentucky, whereas most Democrats are not in favor of right to work laws. Right to work laws would prevent any employee from being forced to join a union and therefore from paying dues. Right to work laws are thought by many to be anti-union, so you really have a split between pro-union and anti-union when you get into the right to work discussion. The data on right to work laws in the states that they exist are pretty mixed. Um, Critics of right to work laws would say that it produces lower salaries, lower incomes, and lower wages while deteriorating conditions, while proponents of right to work laws tend to argue that it brings and attracts more business into the area and therefore offers more employment and in turn perhaps higher salaries, higher incomes, and higher wages. So there's an ongoing national fight uh, around the minimum wage and also around right to work laws. Most polls in Kentucky tend to show that about 55% of Kentuckians are in favor of raising the minimum wage, but also about 55% of Kentuckians are in favor of passing some form of the right to work legislation that's out there. Also, a discussion in the chapter about outsourcing, the common practice of simply allowing others to do work for you. And in the global or international trade arena and within labor markets, outsourcing simply means allowing other countries to produce products for us. Uh, like we all know that China produces toys, tennis shoes, and thousands of other items that we import into the United States and therefore use. Good discussion on immigration toward the end. Immigration is also a big topic nationally and culturally, but also when it comes to labor markets. Are we going to allow a freer flow of immigration, which would be more and more workers trying to enter the workforce? Or are we going to limit in some way and restrict immigration, which would then tighten the labor market and the workforce? You need to be familiar with a marginal product of labor. There's a good discussion about that, and one of our problems focuses on that. And marginal product of labor is simply change in total product of labor output divided by a change in the number of workers or laborers that we have. So marginal product of labor is an important concept that can be put into a graphical form where we can measure the importance and intensity of per worker, how much they're producing in a certain enterprise. So chapter 7 focuses on labor markets. Um, Read it intently. It does connect back to supply and demand, and is an important chapter as we move forward.